sit back in your seats, get something to eat, and watch this movie. Don't let the kids see it, because, well, we'll let you hear the beginning first. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Left of the Projector. I am your host, Evan, back again with another film discussion from the left. Before we get into this week's discussion, I have a couple new announcements to make. The first, I have launched a Ko-Fi site where you can subscribe to the podcast or make a donation to help cover the costs of the show. You can check it out at ko-fi.com/leftoftheprojector. As well, you can also follow the show on Instagram, TikTok, as well as YouTube at Left of the Projector Pod. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. All right, thank you for joining me. This week we will be covering the new remake/sequel, Candyman. And to join me to discuss it is three-peat guest, Emlie. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me again.
Yes. Thank you for coming back. But like I said in the very brief mention is that this Candyman film has sort of a confusing way you could describe it. So I called it a sequel, but some people call it a remake. But it is a direct sequel to the original film of the early 90s. So do you think, because we were just kind of discussing this before, is there is like different ways of thinking of making horror movie sequels, since I feel like horror movies are the most commonly sequelized movies. Is that a word? So do you think that it was smart to do, even before we get into it, like to make this kind of a homage to the first and not a remake?
Yeah, absolutely. I happen to actually really enjoy their plot structure. How they used the first movie's plot and to play into the sequel. Yeah, I absolutely thought that was smart on their part, and I thought it was also smart for them to pretend like Candyman 2 and 3 did not exist.
I was saying before that this is very much like the Halloween issue where they released, Carpenter's original movie. They made a whole bunch of sequels and remakes, and Rob Zombie made some movies, and then they just like pretended those all didn't exist and started from new sequels the last 4 or 5 years. And honestly, they're really good. And I thought this movie was awesome. So anyone who hasn't seen Candyman, I would suggest to see the original first. I think it will make more sense because there's lots of callbacks to the original movie, scenes that they reference, characters they reference. So I guess as we jump into the movie, maybe a quick kind of background on the plot of the movie and kind of where it takes place. So this all takes place in Chicago, and the original movie takes place in sort of a housing project that is brought back in the sequel that we're going to be focusing on. And I think it's an interesting way that they decided to do this is they showed the place that it happened in both movies. And in the original, it's this housing project. But in the sequel, being that it's, the 2020s, it's now like completely gentrified. And I think it's like the perfect personification of how I know. It's just perfect.
Yeah, no, they absolutely did. They captured the reality of what we've seen happen around some of the neighborhoods we all grew up around. Because the gap is true to reality. The movie came out, the original came out in 92. The sequel that we're analyzing now, 2021 or 2020? 21. So it honors that 30-year or so gap.
Yeah, I blanked on the location. So it's called Cabrini Green in Chicago. And what I think is really cool too, and I was watching this movie, and I think when I was watching the new one, had those like on-screen trivia things, which normally I ignore, but I was kind of stopping every once in a while. And it was interesting how they talked about the actual neighborhood because they filmed it in the same location, but only one small portion of that complex was left, and they actually used footage of it. I think it's like the townhouses, which plays a big role towards the end of this movie, and I think it adds to the ambiance of the movie, especially given the plot of the first one, or sorry, the new one.
Yeah,
we'll get
the
into.
imagery is super on point in this film. I think they call it mise en scene in the showbiz. They do a
Okay.
lot of cool stuff with graffiti, but then they also do, the housing that you mentioned, like the beigeish, yellowish brick housing. Is that the one you're talking about?
Exactly. Yep. That's the
The
one.
colors reminded me of a bee.
Oh, well, that's yes. Wow. That now that you said that, that like makes it all
Yeah.
I mean, not make sense, but yeah. So again, well, obviously there's spoilers in this, but both in the original movie and in the sequel or remake, whatever you want to call it, there's the initial, I think in both of the opening credits, there's odes to a bee, which plays a role in the Candyman sort of legend. So, we'll go into that. But I think as the new movie, we'll have to call it just the one we're talking about. And the other one we'll just refer to as OG, I guess.
Yeah.
But the beginning of this movie is we have two characters primarily in this film. We have Brianna and Anthony. They are a couple, and Anthony is an artist, painter. And so he is, we immediately see them in this fancy condo, which, was part of this gentrification. And he's kind of using, maybe I'm jumping too far ahead, but he's using sort of the changing of this location as part of his kind of muse. That's not the word I was thinking of, but sort of like his inspiration. So he's like out taking pictures and he gets stung by the bee, which you mentioned, which I think sets off really the entire movie.
See, that's interesting that you saw the bee as the catalyst that sort of starts the whole boulder rolling down the hill, so to speak, because he enters Cabrini Green and that was it. It was curtains for Anthony after that, because it was like that was Candyman finding him.
Right. He's like he goes to where he
was supposed to.
His spirit lives.
Yeah,
right?
I don't want to give too much away right now in the beginning of the podcast, although perhaps people that are listening have already seen it, but I mean, it makes sense why that bee would seek him out. You know what I mean? At Cabrini Green.
Yeah, no, I hear you loud and clear, and I think maybe we'll get to that if someone listens to half this and they're like, oh crap, I got to go see this movie, because if you haven't seen it, you definitely should. And as in any of these episodes, there's always going to be spoilers. So I think what's interesting about this is that it also, I feel like, leans heavily. One of the notes I wrote here is after we kind of see him with the bee and he gets stung by the bee on his hand, which is what I was alluding to. And then they kind of take you to their apartment, which is this super fancy condo, which we learn is actually paid for primarily by Brianna, his girlfriend. And I feel like they're leaning into the story of the grad student from the original who lives with this professor.
Yeah, that was their method to kind of introduce the backstory, so people who hadn't seen the original could be there with the rest of the audience that had. So if you haven't seen the original, they do set it up so you will not be lost.
Exactly, yes. It's not one of those situations where, if you didn't see the original movie, you're lost, which I think is well done, that they don't make it, one of these weird things. Same thing with like the Halloween movie. Like you didn't have to see the first one. Everyone, knew what happened. That's more of a famous movie, I guess, than this one. But they really lean into the story, and, the whole sort of setup as we kind of get through the first act is really him, his girlfriend is, works in the art industry and promoting artists and working with galleries. And so we see probably the most awful character in this entire movie, who you hate from the beginning, is the white, sort of rich art dealer who works at this, art gallery. I couldn't help but laughing every time he was in a scene in this movie. It just he was built to be hated so tremendously.
Every single scene, disagreeable. He's they put good effort and succeeded admirably in making him a detestable character.
Yeah, and so part of what led to I know we kind of jumped to it, and maybe I'm going too fast in the movie. There's things that I've kind of passed over, but what ends up leading to his putting the art into this installation was that kind of the bee sting and him getting, inspiration from Cabrini Green and where he lived and the whole thing. And his art that he puts into this gallery is not well received by this douchebag art dealer who owns the gallery. And there's a critic who comes who doesn't even get it really either, or doesn't seem to. And it was very, it was this really leaning into this sort of like rich versus poor. He seems to be more like coming from a poor middle class background, kind of getting a chance to display his talent, whereas this art dealer and even his girlfriend seem to have kind of the opposite story.
That is definitely something that could be analyzed from that scene. I saw this critic woman in that scene. She comes up to his art piece, say his name, I believe was the title of his art piece.
Yep.
And he starts explaining that it's supposed to be like gentrification and sort of like the ill-disposed sort of redlining sort of deals. And she goes in on him, man. Like, she is vicious and condescending and super belittling. And if memory serves, she's basically points fingers at artists. So she goes, you guys are the ones who are causing this problem. You guys come to low income neighborhoods so you can spare yourself the drudgery of a working day job, which is laughable because art cannot sustain you even if you live in a low income neighborhood. So she's already just out of touch, but also she's blaming the working class for an issue that is perpetrated by the laws of capitalism. She is a neoliberal, not nice person. She's not a nice person.
Yeah, and she also, I wrote down, the quote that I think you're referring to says, "You're kind," referring, at first you think she means black people, but then she kind of backtracks and says artists, because so the line is, your kind are the real pioneers of that cycle. It's like the cycles of poverty, gentrification, but she's like, I feel like it was obvious what she meant to say. And then she's like, oh, actually, no, I meant this other way.
Oh,
so
that's true. She could have been saving face as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from my listening of that scene, I watched it a couple times because I had to write down those lines. Yeah. I think that she did mean it in the way that she said it, that was artists, but like the double entendre is like completely impossible to ignore.
I mean, also she went in there wanting to belittle his work. I mean, it's hard to ignore that, Karen type white people will often do this to POC for no good reason at all. It's like this weird egotistical power play that is just ingrained in them, and I feel like that was definitely being displayed here in this scene with this critic.
Yeah, and I think it kind of sets it, to me, I feel like it sets into motion some of Anthony's, I feel like his decision making as he goes forward, where he, learns about the Candyman, legend, and then kind of leads him on the path for the rest of the movie. I feel like the critic kind of like gives him that push, and he starts drinking, and he gets drunk and has an argument with the art gallery owner. And I think he tells the art gallery owner, I didn't even write down his name. He doesn't deserve to have his name mentioned. He's just art gallery owner. But he tells Tony he wouldn't be famous if not for his rich girlfriend, which is crazy. And then I have to say this because I wrote this down. I just found it so funny. His girlfriend, or the person who worked at the gallery, who was kind of the girlfriend of the owner, her name was Jerica. I don't know if you noticed that.
I didn't. Jerica.
Yeah, I don't know why I find that funny. Maybe I shouldn't be making fun of someone's name, but it felt like a very assistant who works at an art gallery. And if you didn't know what her profession was, that would be what it was.
Yeah, I could totally see a BoJack Horseman character being called Jerica, 100%, like a goldfish or something.
Yeah, but that was sort of I don't know. I mean, maybe we went past some of that scene, but I feel like that was a turning point in the movie. I don't know if you thought so.
Yes.
With that art.
So we had the B. This was the beginning of his transition, and then this was a definite step down on his staircase of madness. 100%. This got things lubricated. It got things moving.
Yeah, exactly. He's starting to. I think it's partly maybe this is. I just thought of this now. Is maybe he has what his background is. You know that he's from maybe not the best neighborhood, but he also didn't quite. You don't quite.
Because he doesn't know.
Oh yeah, you're right. You're right.
Until the very end, because his mom lied to him.
That's right. Okay, so then maybe that still plays what I'm thinking here. So you don't know where he's from, and he doesn't kind of reveal it. And so what he's kind of now doing, he's drinking, he's getting angry at this dumbass art critic, and he's like, wants to get into and learn about himself. And I think that's what leads him to then go to Cabrini Green, and he jumps the fence to see the old neighborhood. And so he's slowly, getting there. And it's like any good horror movie, you have that first 30, 40 minutes where things are funny, and it's, you're getting a feel for the characters. And I think this is like the shot in the arm.
Well, he meets the janitor. I think he's a janitor. There's like some guy over in Cabrini Green, and he like talks to him and starts revealing aspects about, I feel like it was about, what was the original girl's name? Something Lyle. What is her name? Helen Lyle or something?
Yes, Helen Lyle. Yes, that's right.
He starts telling some stuff about that, or was he talking about? Do you know who I'm talking about? The when he jumped.
Yeah, he's in. Exactly. Yeah. So he's talking to the laundromat guy, and he's telling him this. He's kind of going into like the legend of Cabrini Green, and the whole thing.
He introduces him as Sherman. This is the man who introduces Candyman as Sherman. This is when we learn about Candyman, when he goes to Cabrini Green.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So he's it's almost like he went earlier, kind of tiptoed in at the beginning, and he gets the bee sting, and then now he's like digging deeper, and he wants to to go deeper into his art, and in doing so he meets this person who kind of sends him on his tumultuous journey for the rest of the film.
Yeah, that character in that scene in the end with the church, he calls it him coming back to Cabrini Green, perfect symmetry. So I believe the bee stung him, and now he's able to see this sort of supernatural kind of like origin story guy. He's like an encyclopedia of sorts, but he turns out to be quite important in the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird how they kind of introduce him. It's sort of like, I don't want to call it like a MacGuffin because he is important in the movie, but it also feels like, I don't know. We won't get to the end just yet.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. But yeah, so the art critic then writes a story. I think this is now kind of happening at the same time as the.
We don't want to skip over the art critic, not the art critic, but the art guy got killed, and then she becomes all interested in Anthony's work because.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Dude, yeah, go ahead. No, you should go ahead. Explain that part because that's like, I think that's like the key point where actually that needs to happen for him for like a lot of the dying to start happening.
Yeah, it's the first blood of the show. But
after the first murder is always the best, right?
Very important. It's if it's not good, it's very disappointing. But yeah, after the show, it shows this guy who owns the gallery, presumably, who's with this girl, and they're like doing dirty talk, and it's very like explicit. And she calls Candyman, and he comes, and then they're subsequently mutilated. And then,
yeah, I think it's like with a hook, right?
Yeah, that's Candyman's trope: the bees and the hooks.
Like brutally murdered. Like the first murder was brutal.
They're all pretty bad. They film them pretty tastefully. That they're not like gore porn.
No, yeah, I think in this it's pretty good. But yeah, so you're right. So they're murdered, and then kind of what sets it off then is that his girlfriend now, Brianna, witnesses their bodies, and then it leads to the critic, like you said. She starts doing digging. She finds out about the Candyman legend because of his story,
and that too.
Right, exactly. And so now, because of this story, which it also strikes me as interesting that this art critic is writing stories about something that's kind of out of her lane. No?
I mean, she's trying to capitalize because obviously she's a neoliberal piece of trash. So she,
Yeah, especially when we see her apartment later.
right, but that's what I mean, she was so disinterested at first. Oh, but now there's this big, breaking murder that happened with his piece. Now she's interested. She can capitalize on it.
There's a payday. There's a book.
Right. So now she's interested.
Right. So that's kind of what ends up, and then Tony goes to visit her. And kind of one thing that we should mention too, as this is happening, is that the bee sting on his hand, like on his sort of by his thumb, is getting worse and worse. It's like spreading. He had a Band-Aid on it and it's just crusting.
They cut to it a lot.
Like, I feel like
they
what's
cut
that?
to it a lot. Like they show it a lot. So like they're kind of like,
yes.
like this is important. Pay attention to his worsening hand.
And I almost feel like that was like grosser than like the murders. Like I don't know, like scars always give me like the creeps. Maybe it's just me.
No, body horror it's some of the most spine tingling horror out there. So they had body horror elements in it. That's not the only body horror thing that they did. He rip his nail off at one point or something.
He does, yeah. Like when his hand is like complete. Well, like yeah, when his hand gets like really. Well, but so like the thing that I wrote down when I was watching this part, and I think you don't realize it yet, or maybe it's super obvious, is this is right after the art critic, and he like ends up leaving the art. She like goes to the art critic's house to have a conversation with her, and he just bounces, like he starts having crazy visions. And the first thing I wrote down on my notes was that Anthony is now becoming the Candyman. And I actually wrote in quotes, not in quotes, I just wrote next to that, hell yeah, for some reason. That was just my reaction, because it felt like it was supposed to happen that way, even though you didn't know it early on. Like that's the bee getting
They foreshadowed it well, actually, with his dreams, with the bee's sting, with the hallucinations. And then there was that whole like really trippy scene where he's like looking at himself in the mirror and he's Candyman.
Yes, that was also super creepy. A lot of the dream sequences, they had some in the original movie too. So one thing about the original movie is that they bring a lot of the same imagery, but it's definitely different in like a I don't want to say it's like a better way, but you have to also think about 30 years after, just
it's better.
Beside the point.
They have more technologies now,
right? And actually, one thing that I think we should. Maybe we know we haven't gotten to the whole movie. We haven't gotten to all the deaths. So I guess right after this too is the art critic also dies in her right after Tony leaves her apartment. You see her like dragged along the edge of her like super glitzy fancy apartment too. So like everyone has really fancy apartments in this movie, except for like the Calabrini Green scenes, which are this housing project. So I feel like that also gives you that. Yeah, shows like the gentrification and shows, and also with the exception, I guess, of Brianna's apartment, which was from that same neighborhood. The other characters that have these nice apartments are white, as they're usually perceived as the gentrifiers. But I think that, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So they're also given this information that the Candyman isn't like a single person. It's meant to be this group of people over different periods of time. So like the whole history that they kind of talk about in the original, that's one thing they actually changed. I don't know if you maybe saw this. It's like slight, but they kind of changed the original, or maybe I'm wrong. Did they change like the backstory from the original painter who painted like the rich white people? Was it the same?
It's always been that Daniel Robitaille. It was always the same for all the movies. This was the backstory. What they took, what was different, is that the other three films depicted Candyman as sort of just like enacting the vitality of his vengeance, because his spirit was like seeking vengeance, and he was just he's the whisper on the wall, he's the blood on the street, and those are the things he would say, be my victim. It was basically he was enacting vengeance. Now this new Candyman, although has a little bit of that element going on, there is a new element introduced where he is the manifestation, racism, essentially.
Yep.
That's what, again, this is like the final scene, so I don't want to get too really
Yeah.
into it, but they make it quite plain that Candyman is not just enacting vengeance, he's a literal embodiment of, the cruelties and the pain.
No, I think it's fair to we don't have to talk about the actual scene, but one of the questions that I posed to you that maybe it's a good point, I think now, is in both the original movie and in this one, the idea of the Candyman, and kind of from his own words, is that he needs to exist to have his story, his legend, be told by people. So I guess the question then is that I wrote, I have some thoughts too, but I want to hear yours, is why did the black community need Candyman? And I guess we kind of know what he represents. I mean, you kind of just went through it a little bit, but what do you think is the reason, maybe not from the Candyman's perspective, but kind of, especially in this new one, we see a lot of images of like the boy at the project. And the same thing actually in the original too. There are often some scenes with, children. So that was a very long-winded way of asking what you thought he is and means to the community.
Well, yeah, I kind of did just answer that question. In the original, he was just this Daniel Robitaille ghost. The Sherman aspect still kind of confuses me, I'm not going to lie. I really don't understand how Daniel Robitaille becomes Sherman, the guy who stands outside the projects and gives out candy.
Mm-hmm.
But hey, I'm with it. That's what they're presenting. That's the story. And then again, he's become more of a representation of the violence that's perpetrated through racism and brutality and things like that. And that would make sense why specifically like the black community would want Candyman's mythology to be presented forth. But they made it also plain that Candyman's legend was somewhat buried at this point. Like, Anthony resurrected Candyman. They wanted the legend to die.
Exactly. I think that's part of, what happened at the end of I think it makes a good mention. I'm gonna spoil the end of the original film a little bit, but when the woman dies, you mentioned her name, Helen Lyle. She ends up dying at the end of the first movie to save this child that had been stolen by Candyman. And then at the very end, at her funeral, no one comes to the funeral except I think her like ex-husband and the woman. But then at the very end, which I didn't expect at all, is you see the black community from Calabrini Green have that kind of procession up to kind of honor her. And what's so interesting to me is how did it go from that to being forgotten? And that's why, Sherman wants to kind of resurrect the story. It feels like it somehow got taken. And is it because, as I'm saying it in my head, is it because sort of they perceived it as this sort of white woman taking over sort of like the mantle from the black community as the ultimate gentrification of a legend of a black, person?
I'm not certain, because I mean, Helen wasn't a very big character in the new one. In the original, I mean, it was sort of like the white savior sort of deal by the end of it, which is just, it makes you want to roll your eyes, with them all sort of honoring her in that way, when it's just like, yeah, well, she was part of the system that made Candyman in the first place, but, she did go into the fire and save the baby, so, okay, we'll let it slide. But it had that flavor. In this one, though, in the sequel, they call that right out. Remember when they're telling the story in the beginning with the cool shadow puppet?
Yes, that was super awesome.
That was super cool. But they were saying it, she's like this white grad student coming in, doing her little project on the projects. And,
Yeah, that's right.
They hint at it that she was sticking her nose in business where she ought not be and sort of appropriating the legend for her own benefit.
Yeah, that was to me was like one of the main themes that I wrote down from the original was sort of like this white woman having this sort of complex, to benefit from the misfortune of the black community, which is, a story as old as time, I guess you
could
say.
The white savior complex.
I think what we need to now do is kind of bring up the sort of big reveal of this movie that kind of changes the entire trajectory of the final act. And this is when we have Anthony finally go seeing his mother. So like throughout the movie, his mother is constantly trying to call him and talk to him. And you're like, oh, he doesn't want to deal with her mother. And then finally he goes and he has this weird feeling because his hand is like crumbling. It's super gross. He gone to the hospital. He gets out, sees his mother and finds out that he had lived in Cabrini Green until he was 2 years old. And that he was the baby from the original movie. And I wrote in my notes, like little comment was like, they totally allude to it. And like it's one of those like reveals where you're like, of course I should have known that. But like, it still is like surprising. It surprised me. Anyway.
I hadn't seen the original one. I watched this first. So I was surprised. I did not put that together. I thought it was a fun twist. I enjoyed it. I like how they did the reveal and how they foreshadowed it. Because again, when they do reveal it, you're like, oh yeah,
right, exactly. Of course he was.
And so that's indicative of really good writing, in my opinion. So I really enjoy that aspect.
Yeah, and like I think after you had seen the first one, so again, I think we've mentioned it before, but the Helen. I think I just mentioned is that he had this baby was pulled out of the fire that Candyman had taken this baby as sort of like a sacrifice or something you want to call it to maybe take the mantle on and become the next iteration of Candyman to push his legend forward. But then Helen saves the baby, and so that ends up becoming him. And so it makes perfect sense that when he gets stung by the bee at the beginning of the movie, he is basically, it was almost like destiny. I hate using that word in movies, but I feel like it is kind of like a destiny.
It was perfect symmetry as per one of the characters. He was the baby in the first one. Candyman has had his eye on Anthony for some time, 30 years or so to be exact.
And it's like he needed him to enter Cabrini Green, right? Like nothing. I mean, they don't say how old he is, but he's presumably mid to late 20s, and he gets stung by the bee because he enters Candyman's turf, and that enables him to manifest himself.
And his art project resurrects the legend. People start calling Candyman all over Chicago again. And so
those kids in high school.
Yeah, that scene was fucking brutal. But
that was probably like the most brutal murder scene in the whole
yeah,
movie.
It was. But you gotta have the group of teenagers get killed. It's a horror. It's the horror trope of that lasts that through the ages.
Yes, that's true, and not just high school kids. They're like being jerks, and they're making fun of the legend. I think that's part of what I think in the first movie too, and I think is part of the trope too of what ends up not just bringing Candyman is you saying his name 5 times. It's like you're taunting him because whenever those kids were like joking about how it's like, oh, you don't believe in this stupid thing, but then when they do it, they do get scared. It's like they actually are scared. So they need people to have this fear of it to have it exist within the white gentrified community too.
Yeah, just like racism, really. The institutions, antagonisms that capitalism puts forth to keep us all divided. Same basic principle.
Right, and in that scene in the bathroom, not to belabor this this scene, but wasn't there a girl who comes in who I think was black, and she goes into the stall, and they're like making fun of her, but she's spared. which I think also leads me to a point that I mentioned to you before, is that with the exception of one person in this entire movie, all of the victims were white people, which is sort of like turning the narrative on its head. I think also of like a trope of movies like, oh, the first person to die in a horror movie is like the black character. I think that was like Scream who kind of used that trope. So I think it's interesting that it turns it on its head and it's like, lashing out at the white gentrifiers.
Yeah, no, we absolutely. I do believe that they purposefully did that. As one, like you said, sort of like a fuck you to the trope that, people of color have been historically known to be used as sort of red shirts of the horror genre.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
exactly,
it was nice to see the shoe on the other foot and to see them die so exquisitely at that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I think the movie does a good job, I think, on turning tropes the other way. And I think aside from just the writing of the movie, I don't think we mentioned this, but Jordan Peele was one of the producers of this film, and is also.
And
what's that? Did he write too? Oh, he was one of the writers.
Yeah, and the director also helped write it too.
Okay. So I guess I should have done more homework, but yeah, you are right. He did some of the writing, which is ironic because the film that will be released before this episode will be on Get Out, which is a Jordan Peele movie that wasn't intentional. But he is like a brilliant screenwriter. From Get Out is just a phenomenal movie. But I think he does such a great way in all of his films, even though this one maybe isn't like fully his film, of turning those narratives on their head and bringing racism forward. And I think he succeeds in Get Out. And I think in this movie I feel like making white people uncomfortable. I don't know if you think that's true.
I don't think that he's trying to make white people uncomfortable. I think that writers write what they know. I think that their experience in their life influence their work, and I think Jordan Peele is a classic example. Racism and those sorts of themes play into his work so much because he experiences them and he sees them happening to his community. So they're poignant to him and they influence him. And
right, no, that's a good point. Like I shouldn't. I mean, maybe I should have been what you're saying, which I think actually makes a lot more sense. That it's not necessarily an intentional thing. He's coming from. I think Get Out is actually, without jumping to that movie too much, like that movie feels like he is describing his experience as a black man in a predominantly, white racist society. So I think it comes out so obviously. So you don't need to try, I guess, is what you're kind of saying.
Absolutely. When you read a person's writing, sometimes, they're playing a character, but there's a lot of times the thoughts you're seeing are their thoughts. The traumas you see or read are their traumas. You just never know which is which.
Right. Well, I guess that also makes good writing, huh?
All the best writers would say so. I believe that if you're always projecting from a third party perspective, your work will suffer for it if it's entirely this way.
Right. And maybe jumping a little bit back into some of a couple of notes that I have, since we're kind of getting to the final couple scenes, which all take place in Cabrini Green. And this is a note that I wrote down, and I don't know if what I was thinking about when I wrote it, and maybe you can unpack what I wrote, but I wrote down that the Cabrini Green was kind of like stuck in a loop. And so within that little, like unpacking it to what I wrote or was thinking of, was that they want Candyman to take back the community and, creates this new Candyman narrative that will create a new story and his legend will live on. But I'm not sure why I wrote it as kind of a loop. Maybe what I was thinking of is that, you have the constant, murder of black bodies by police, which will play a part in the very final scene. And so it's kind of like this loop that they're trying to to stop. And maybe it was something that character Sherman said that made me think of that. Does that Does any of that make any
So,
sense?
I mean, there is a loop sort of theme in the movie, which could be influencing your perspective because, the perfect symmetry of like the baby is Anthony, and then he now is the new Candyman to continue the legend. So that's two loops. Gentrification isn't so much of a loop as much as a half circle.
Yeah, it's a one way ticket to.
Yeah, but obviously, in the end, it's plain. Anthony's now Candyman. Candyman's now resurrected. So it's come full bagel. You know what I mean? Like, that is a circle.
Yeah.
He was gone for 30 years and now he's back. That's three.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. No, but you're right. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like there was something else about that I was thinking about. I think it's so the final scene, which I think is maybe the point to kind of discuss since we're gone through the movie. Maybe there's some other things to discuss as well. But the Sherman basically kidnaps, or well, I guess he doesn't even really kidnap him. He
gets accused of putting razor blades into candy, and then he's gunned down by the police.
Yes, exactly. Well, I was going to say is that what then Sherman, quote unquote, kidnaps Anthony, but it's not really, right? He like kind of goes on his own accord because he feels this connection.
Possessed, yeah.
Yeah, like the bee sting has now like basically taken up his whole arm. And as I think the point where I knew he was becoming the Candyman is because part of the legend of Candyman is that he loses they cut off his hand. And then he has to insert a hook into it. Well, so you see his hand.
There. Like, it's all torture.
Oh, right. Yeah. Right. Right. Exactly. So I feel like once you start seeing his hand deteriorate, I feel like I was waiting for it, right?
Absolutely. I didn't really put together that he was going to be Candyman until that scene I spoke on earlier when he was looking at himself in the mirror in that trance and he was Candyman. I was like, oh, he's becoming Candyman. I didn't know why. That's when I clicked.
Was that the same? Was that when he was at the critics' house?
No, you're thinking. I think what you were talking about is the final scene or the prerequisite of the final scene because it's like, oh, I was baptized in this church and like Anthony's facing the wall and he still has his hand at this point.
Yes.
But right. Yeah, he starts talking about and this is the laundromat guy, the janitor. This guy.
Yep, this little creepy guy who kind of is throwing like somehow it's always well it's weird because I feel like you always need, again, I hate calling things like MacGuffin, but he's feeding him it's like he's feeding him the information that he needs to become and transform into what he's destined to be. Like he's giving him the information so that he could transform his art, and then the art transforms him and vice versa. And I think it's also perfect that he's an artist because that's literally what the profession of the original Candyman, that's what he got in trouble for. He was an artist. I think we briefly mentioned it. I guess we didn't mention it. So he was an artist who would paint, rich white people and falls in love with the daughter of one of the rich white slave owners. And so he ends up getting, brutally murdered and tortured and mutilated for this crime. And that's what creates the original inception of Candyman.
And they cover him in bees. That's why the bees are so important.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think they yes, exactly. And so the bees constantly are a thing in the movie. Yeah. But in that final scene is then also Brianna, who you kind of write off. I feel like I wrote her off as being like, she is not going to help.
I like her. I liked her. I liked her character the entire movie. I enjoyed her.
Yes, no, I shouldn't mean like that. I didn't think that I didn't like her character, but I didn't expect the twist of her going to try and save Anthony, because I guess the idea is that, even though there was all this craziness happening, she was starting to feel or sense there was something else at play. I think that almost drew her to saving him, and then she ends up getting, tied up by Sherman. And then eventually escaping, which then allowed, sort of the final scene of this movie, which is freaking awesome. The last scene of this movie is, well, both sad and awesome. But what ends up happening, which is the perfect amalgamation of this movie, is that the cops come in when Sherman had called the cops saying that that he had found Candyman, and they come and they end up killing.
I have to interrupt you. I think
please.
You keep calling William Sherman. The laundromat character's name is William. Sherman is the reincarnated entity of Daniel Robitaille.
Yes, you're right.
So
you're right.
You're thinking of William.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry. I should. No. You're. I appreciate the correct. And I feel like you mentioned it earlier, and then in my head I just switched the two.
No, it makes sense because he introduces us to Sherman, so it makes sense. That's all.
Yes.
Continue.
Right. No. Yeah. So So you're saying is that William, is the one who's ends up calling the cops and needs Candyman to die at the hand of the police. It seemed like to me, so that his legend and his name could reincarnate and become this person. And Brianna is there to try and save him, and she sees them basically gun down both of them. They're both murdered. And the one thing I also will note is that all the cops who arrive on the scene, they're all white. I noticed that. And then another thing that I noticed about this movie, and I think this is a callback to the first one, in the first movie and maybe in the second one too, is they constantly mention how the cops ignored Cabrilli Green until it became a white gentrified neighborhood. They didn't care what happened. They wanted it to crumble on its own. That's kind of like the way it works, is they let the crime, get worse and worse. They let it happen, and then they can go in and get everyone out and then gentrify it. So I think it made perfect sense that the cops come in to the old Cabrini Green housing development, which the remaining houses are there to perpetrate this, this murder.
Well, absolutely, because as we all know, the police are the protectors of private enterprise. And we all know that redlining and class antagonisms, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., are tools of oppression. So if you make a housing project with the ambition of deteriorating one of these disenfranchised classes, predominantly people of color in this respect, police are going to ignore your crime. They're going to ignore your cries for help. The Dahmer series is super popular right now. It's all a buzz. I mean, that was a centralized theme there too. The intentional flippancy of the police leading to terrible things happening, and predominantly happening to communities of color.
Yep. No, well said. And I think so it's like a perfect, well-written scene. And then when the final kind of moment of this movie is that Brianna is then taken into custody, and she's put in the back of the police car, and they're basically telling her, this can go one of two ways. Because I'm sure this is a very real conversation. Like, you can either be quiet about what you saw, or you can go to prison, and we can just make up whatever we want. And who's going to believe you with no witnesses, or 10 white cops? And she's faced with this conundrum, and I feel like the filming of this last scene, it's in the back of an SUV, and the cops in the front kind of holding this power play. He's the cop in the front, she's in the back, and she's handcuffed, and you think it's over. And what is she going to do? Is she going to risk her career, which is now blowing up because people want her to be this art dealer or art critic, not critic, whatever, it doesn't matter. Or she can, throw it all away. And what does she do? She leans into the Candyman and summons him, but in the most awesome way possible.
She really does sell that shit. But I feel bad for her, because when the police arrive on scene, she actually screams to them for help. She yells, in here. She thinks they're going to help her. And then, they throw her in the back. And then, this fucking pig, man. Kudos to the actor, though, because I believed him. He played that shit well. Because he's doing, the whole... basically trying to coerce her into a confession.
Exactly. Yes, that's a better way to say it.
Feeding her different scenarios, being see how many different ways I can spin how guilty you are. Like, you better start talking. And so she basically hounds him. She's like, all right, you want me to talk? Well, I'll show you what the fuck happened. And she summons the culprit.
But what's so cool about it is, because Candyman has to be summoned by looking in the mirror, you're in a car, what do? And she says to turn, she wants to look in the mirror, so turning the rear view mirror back to her. And he's thinking like, what the fuck what are you talking about? Why do you need to look in the mirror? But at the same time, he's thinking, well, if she's going to corroborate my story and I can get away from just murdering another black man, sure, what the hell? He doesn't believe the Candyman story. He probably hasn't even read any of these articles about it from the art critic. So she says, what's that? yeah. Pig, I guess the pig can't read.
No,
right?
that'd be erroneous, Evan.
Yes. But so and actually it's funny you say that, because in my last note was that she brings the Candyman to murder the pigs. And so she says Candyman into the rearview mirror. And of course you think like, oh, he's safe inside the car. But what happens is all the cops that are outside of the car just get brutally, brutally murdered. And so you thinking like he's freaking out. You think he's going to be safe. But no.
Yeah. And then he runs away though. See, he's in the car and he's safe, and then he runs away. He leaves her, handcuffed in the back to save his own skin. And yeah, but he don't get far. He don't.
The Candyman doesn't let you leave.
Oh no, he gets.
You're on his turf.
All the cops die in the end, which is chef's kiss.
Yeah, and she gets free from the handcuffs, right?
Oh yeah, she does. And then Candyman comes, and it's now Anthony. He like floats up to her and stuff. As he does, he likes to float places. And yeah, and he starts talking, that's when he basically announces that I am now the embodiment of the pain of my people and of the brutality that has been perpetrated throughout the centuries towards us, and that still happens today. And then it ends.
Yeah, it was a truly a great movie, great ending. I feel like there's nothing glaring about this movie that I felt could have been like drastically, better or like better represented. I feel like they did homage to the first movie. They skipped all the sequels where they kind of changed it, and they just made a great movie. And it was funny because after I watched the original, I looked this movie up because I was looking where I could watch it. And I hate to do this, but sometimes I'll look at the reviews and like the rating numbers. And I think maybe you and I talked about this offline, is that horror movies never are rated well, even if they're awesome. People just never give them their due. And I thought this had like a 50.
You gotta watch out for the synopses too, because it could sound like a piece of shit on the synopses. I don't know who they get to write them, but then you watch it, it's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I think that this has like a 52 on Rotten Tomatoes from the critics, and then maybe a little bit higher from the audience, which I'm not usually one to listen to critics anyway. Like if I want to see a movie and I've heard it's good, someone told me it's good, I'm going to watch it. I don't care if it has a 2 on Rotten Tomatoes, if it's going to be a good movie. But it kind of blew me away because I was like almost expecting it to not be as good. And then it was awesome.
Yes. I like to read reviews on Reddit or on places where other people that watch movies give their opinions. Those places
smart. That
you want to look if you're going to watch reviews. A lot of the time I just ask my sister because she's an encyclopedia of film. She's like you.
No, I don't think I'm an encyclopedia.
But you're going to be modest, that's fine. But my sister she's seen literally everything. So I just ask her, I'm like, what do you think of this? And she will 9 times out of 10 have an opinion.
No, but it is smart because I do follow a bunch of, more recently actually than before, like the last few months. I think it's like a few people on like TikTok who are specifically horror fans and have, most of their videos and content is related to horror movies. And they'll mention a horror movie that I'd never even heard of. And then I look it up and I'm like, this movie sounds terrible. But then I'll watch it and I'll be like, damn, all those people who said it was terrible are just completely either they just don't like horror movies, which I think is often the case. Like if you're not into horror movies and you watch a horror movie, you might not like it just because you don't like horror movies. Like if I watched, I don't know, I can't think of an example the other way where I'm not going to like it because that's just not my thing.
Well, I mean, if you go in there not liking horror and going to watch it with a certain lens, I mean, think about horror films. I mean, now they're becoming a bit more diluted to what I'm about to say, but I mean, there's lots of sexism, there's lots of racism, there's lots of stuff that you could like politically correctness like nitpick at until the cows come home. So there's that aspect I think turns people off of horror. And then there's also just people don't like gory, spooky stuff. I mean, it's kind of inherently against human nature. We're sort of wired to be averted to these kinds of things. It's just that some people, like you and I, for example, seem to embrace this morbidity. Like we think it's interesting, and it's like a train wreck, you know, and you just like your eyes get wide and your vessels. It's just it's fun, it's thrilling.
Yeah, a good example of that is I was talking to another friend who's been on the podcast a few times, and he was talking. He's like not a huge horror. He likes zombie movies, so we're going to be doing a zombie movie. But he was saying how why horror movies are interesting and kind of what they're kind of like a polar opposite of comedies and other kinds of films. And the comment that I said to him was that I feel like horror movies kind of show us the horrors of capitalism in a different way, rather than it being either a comedy or a drama or a mystery or an action movie, which I guess rarely are that obvious. But I feel like horror movies can show us that literal horror in like a much more interesting lens. I mean, everyone can have their own opinion on which they prefer, but I think that's just my take on it.
I mean, absolutely, because a lot of horror takes place in amongst the downtrodden, shall we say, amongst the outcasts, among the people that society would toss away. A lot of the psychos or the monsters come from a place of rejection or trauma, like nuclear family trauma. Like everything that you see in a horror film, you can almost, if you know how to word it, you can tie it into Marxism, no problem. I agree with that.
Yeah, no, that's true. And it is true for the most part. Horror movies do focus on, I don't mean this word like in a bad way, like the outcast kind of people. I think you said like the downtrodden.
I don't mean that derogatorily at all. I just mean people that society would otherwise turn the other cheek to.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's
up their values.
It gives like kind of a voice to the voiceless of in movies, and I think maybe to your point of why some people are turned off by older horror movies that kind of dug more into those racist and other kind of tropes is that those movies that do that, I feel like kind of well, they could still be a good movie, and I can't think of one specifically off the bat that's kind of has that aspect to it. They're kind of, I guess I'm thinking that some of those movies kind of are antithetical to that idea of talking about the downtrodden when they are disparaging those same people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think sometimes that's true. I think sometimes it's very deep, and they use these sort of really scary concepts in our world, in our very real world, and they tie them into ghosts and ghouls and stuff. But then I also think that there's a whole other faction, a faucet, if you will, where it is nothing so deep. It's actually quite vapid. They are catering to the edgelord gaze. So titties, racism, just, jocular ambiguity. Yeah. It's just, sometimes it's just... but, as horror fans, sometimes I just want to see some good slasher shit. So I just kind of, do something else while that scene is on, the sex. I'm here for the other stuff.
Yeah, no, sometimes it's more like, I think the way I would describe some of those kinds of movies is more like shock horror. than like more thoughtful in some ways. Like where like you can have a good horror movie where the writing isn't that great. I can think of, plenty. But if the writing isn't great and it's very, self-serving, then it's hard to appreciate in the same way. Like all my favorite horror movies, like the top tier ones, all have, smart writing, and they're super interesting, as you said, like Marxist or leftist ideology that can easily be pulled out because I think it's meant to be there.
Yeah. And it's far scarier than any like ghost story that you could possibly imagine because it's real.
Yeah. Yeah. I know we've now strayed a bit from the movie, but I think that's fine. I think that it's good to talk about, horror movie. It would be, I was actually, as we were talking about that, it would be interesting to have a discussion just kind of like about horror movies. And I think it might be interesting to talk about different types of films too, because I feel like another thing that I've mentioned in a few other episodes is that pre and post 9/11 film is like there's lots of differences, but I feel like with horror movies, it actually flipped in a different way, or not as, maybe wasn't as affected as like action movies who all of a sudden were all like anti-Muslim or, pro-imperialist, action movies and stuff like that. Whereas I feel like horror movies kind of flipped in a good way.
Yeah, modern horror is going in a very nice direction lately. They had a really rough decade or so as I was like growing up, because it was all like the Blair Witch, Jennifer's Body, like all that kind of shit coming out and stuff.
I Know What You Did Last Summer.
Yeah, so it's like now we've got stuff like The Ritual, and we've got like Midsummer, and we've got like these Get Out, like these really cool, introspective, like super dimensional horror films. And at this point, if you're gonna put out a horror film, it's just gonna be jump scares and fucking titties. You can just buy your DVD because that's straight where it's going. You're not going to theaters because it's not gonna happen. So like, even like Candyman in the 90s version, it was actually a lot more slashery. It was a lot more violent. There was a lot less depth to the plot. As
Agreed.
Agreed. We're concerned, like antagonisms and class structures and all these kinds of things that we discussed. So I mean, even a franchise that was in that light is now being uplifted to a different standard. It's just a different standard.
Yeah, no, that's all completely agree. I think the other week I was looking, because I like horror movies any time of year, but I watch probably more during this time of year just in general. But I was looking at a list of, scariest, best horror movies of the past 10 or so years. This was probably read like 3 years ago. So the last 10 years. And all these movies are different, like subgenres, if you will, within like the horror. I think that like a movie like Midsummer and those, they've really changed the game. Again, this is going into the weeds on horror, but I think they've changed the game and made so many cool types of horror. Because I used to always be just a fan of just like slasher movies. That was my favorite kind of horror. But now I'm getting into more ones that it's like Hereditary, where it's not a slasher movie. It's creepy and exactly. That's the word I was going to think of. But yeah, as far as Candyman goes, any last thoughts on the movie that we didn't cover before we sign off?
I mean, covering it through a Marxist lens, which is almost impossible to watch any other way, I might add. That's kind of fun of this movie. Usually, we're all like, oh, it was fun watching this movie through a Marxist lens, but you really can't watch this movie through any other lens because gentrification and class antagonisms are such they're a plot point. You can't avoid them. They're just there in your face all the time. I loved it.
Emily, thank you so much for joining me to discuss Candyman, and been great.
Oh, yeah, no, thanks for having me. I had a wonderful time.
Awesome. Well, as always, you can check out the podcast on all platforms, and we will catch you next week with another film from the left.